Why is it so hard to live as a Christian in 21st century Britain? Why is this so hard? Let me give you 3 little snapshots to show how hard it can be. 3 Christians, Rob, Amanda and Paddy. Rob is round at his parents' house with his 3 brothers and sisters, their various partners and children. Rob's mother is going to have a significant birthday, one with a 0 at the end. And while everyone's there, she claps her hands and says, "Big birthday next month. We're going to celebrate it here, Sunday the 5th. Of course," she says, eyeballing Rob, "I expect everyone to be here all Sunday. Don't want anything else getting in the way." Well, what is Rob to do? His mum knows what she's doing. It's almost a challenge. Prove to me, Rob, that I mean more to you than God and the church that you're part of. Amanda is at her team meeting at the beginning of a new week at work. Her team leader is outlining a course of action that the team is going to take. The course of action is at best ethically dubious. At worst, it's downright criminal. Now, it's just worth saying, her team leader concludes, that if you want to make any sort of progress in this company, you'll be getting on board with this. No questions asked. Well, Amanda's heart sinks at the words. How is she going to respond? Paddy is in his university halls of residence, and he hears people on his corridor talking about the party that's coming up that Friday. The drinking's going to start early, and then there's all sorts of other pretty immoral behaviour that's going to go on. "Are you coming to the party, Paddy?" they ask. But that's just the thing. Paddy doesn't know. Should he go to the party? And if he goes, how is he going to make sure that he doesn't get drawn into sinful behaviour? What will the non-Christians on his corridor think if he is at the party? What will they think if he isn't at his party? What should he do? Well, there are 3 scenarios, and in some ways they're made up, but in other ways they're not made up at all, because they're the sort of scenarios that followers of Jesus are facing day in, day out. Maybe you could recognize something of your family or your workplace or your school or college as I described them. Why is it so hard to live as a Christian in 21st century Britain? I want to suggest that it's because living as someone who belongs to God in a culture where most don't accept him is hard and has always been hard. Where we find ourselves in 21st century Britain is in a situation that has much in common with the situation of Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. We're looking this morning at Daniel chapter 1. The context in which Daniel is said is given at the beginning of the book. So chapter 1, verse 1, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God." Judah was the remaining part of God's chosen people. The original nation of Israel, you may know it from the pages of the Old Testament, it had divided, and the northern tribes that remained with the name Israel had over a century earlier been defeated by Assyria. Its people had been taken off into exile in Assyria, far away from their motherland. Judah, the southern tribes, had remained, and if we can have the next slide, Judah is the little orange blob to the east of the Mediterranean. I have a geography degree. I have to say east. You might prefer right, to the right of the Mediterranean. But it's embedded in me. You've got to say east, because if you turn the map upside down, it would be left, not right. Anyway, enough of that. It's the little orange blob. That's the key thing. And its capital was Jerusalem. Now, after the exile of Israel, Judah, it had remained for another 100 years or so. But we read in Daniel 1, in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So if you like dates, we're at 605 BC. Babylon, who are the global superpower, they're the big yellow block that's kind of, well, everywhere. Babylon comes to Judah, and with their ruthless king Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon does a series of attacks against Judah. And in the first of the attacks, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, is captured by the forces of Nebuchadnezzar, and so were some of the vessels of the house of God. So some of the sacred items were taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and they were taken 600 miles from Judah to Babylon. It's shown by the red line on the map. Except, I wonder if you noticed it as we read it. Here at the beginning of Daniel 1, it's not called Babylon. So at end of verse 2, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Now, it is Babylon, so why is it called Shinar here? Well, Daniel is wanting to take his readers back to one very specific event in the Bible. In Genesis 11, we read that as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And what happened on the plain of Shinar? The people built a tower. The tower that became called the Tower of Babel. Why is that significant? Well, because it represents the most full-scale rejection of God and rebellion against him. Shinar is the place where God's authority is rejected. And that is where the book of Daniel is set. In Shinar, in the place where God's authority is rejected. And brothers and sisters, I want to suggest that that is the world that most of us live in. The world where God's authority is rejected. In some ways, Babylon in the 6th century BC and Britain in 21st century AD, they're completely different, and in other ways, they're virtually identical. They are places where the majority of people reject the God of the Bible and the authority that he has. Babylon then and the UK now, in some ways, are like for like. Now, why are King Jehoiakim and the temple artifacts in Shinar? Well, verse 2 tells us, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, so that's into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, with some of the vessels of the house of God. It was God who delivered the king of Judah over and delivered over the treasures from the temple in Jerusalem. Didn't happen by accident or misfortune. This was God who did it. God had consistently warned his people through the prophets, especially through the prophet Jeremiah, that unless they repented for their sin against him, he would send them into exile. So in Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 19, God says, all Judah will be carried into exile. What happened in 605 BC was the beginning of a 20-year process that would end with the whole nation of Judah being exiled and Jerusalem and its temple being destroyed. It was God's doing. Now that must have been very two-edged for those exiles taken to Babylon. There was the sorrow, the trauma of knowing that God had acted in judgment against his people. The deep distress of being taken from their homeland was God's doing. But there must have been a strange comfort as well. Because in Genesis 11, on the plain of Shinar, God had acted to show that he was God and that he was in control even of people who rejected him. That he was in control especially of people who rejected him. Yes, the exiles were in Babylon and Shinar, but God was still in control. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, instructed his his chief eunuch. We won't dwell on the biology of that. It means chief of staff. To take some of the royalty and the nobility of Judah, the creme de la creme of Judah, and he was instructed basically to make them thoroughly Babylonian. So that the chief eunuch, the chief official, is called Ashpenaz, and the king commands him, end of verse 4, to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, that is, the Babylonians. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So these guys are handpicked to receive the finest education that Babylon could offer. In effect, they're at the University of Babylon. And can we see what Nebuchadnezzar's doing here? He's taking the guys who are the potential troublemakers among those exiles in Babylon. If he treated them badly and oppressed them, well, potentially Nebuchadnezzar could have had a problem on his hands. But as well as potential troublemakers, these guys are potential assets. They're, we're told, good-looking, so they're easy on the eye, they're brainy, they're quick to understand new stuff. These are the guys that they've got a string of A stars at GCSE and A-level. They'd have been probably Mensa members. And Nebuchadnezzar, who was no fool himself, realizes the best thing to do with these guys is integrate them as fully as possible into Babylonian society. Why is he wanting to do that? Well, so that they would forget their Jewish background and become Babylonian subjects able to serve him. Verse 6, among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. So here are these 4 guys, Daniel and his friends. How are they going to live in Shinar, in Babylon? How are they going to live? Now, actually, this matters because their situation is our situation. The Apostle Peter addresses his first letter to those who are elect exiles. Exiles. An exile is a temporary resident in a foreign place. If the UK isn't your country of birth, you may be able to relate to this. You know exactly what it means to be an exile, to be living in a strange land away from home. But actually, this is spoken to all Christians. All Christians are exiles because the true home of the Christian is not the UK in 2020. Our true home is in heaven. It means we're exiles in this world, which means that the experience of these 4 guys, particularly this chapter focuses on Daniel, their experience is recorded for us in God's word of what it means to live faithfully as exiles. Their experience will help us as we think what it means for us to live faithfully as exiles in this world. So let's go back to the story of Daniel and his friends. You're in their situation. What do? You're receiving the finest education that Babylon can provide. And studying is hard work, we know that, makes you hungry. And to sustain them in their studies, it's not pot noodles and pasta that they have. It's a very atypical student lifestyle. No. Let's have a look at verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah would have been forgiven for thinking that actually they'd pretty much landed on their feet here. Yeah, they'd had the trauma of exile, but life is turning out pretty well. They'd have enjoyed the education they were receiving. They'd have lapped it up. The Babylonian society was far more advanced than anything they'd have had before. So they'd have had teaching in mathematics and astrology. It would have far outdone anything they'd had before, anything they'd been taught in Jerusalem. Really, you could argue that what lay before these young men was the opportunity of a lifetime. Wouldn't the best thing be just to grasp the opportunity with both hands? Forget about the God of Judah. After all, going with him hasn't exactly done you a pile of good, just become thoroughly Babylonian. And that's certainly what the name changes they were given was encouraging. Verse 7, the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Now, we don't instantly pick up the significance of this name change. With the exception of Daniel, it's the change from one unpronounceable name to a different, also unpronounceable name. But in fact, something much more significant is going on here. That the names they came with, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they're names that are taken from the Hebrew words for God, either El or Yahweh. But those Hebrew names, with God's name embedded within them, are changed into names that come from the Babylonian gods. So the name Daniel means God is my judge, but he's renamed Belteshazzar by the chief of staff. And Belteshazzar means, may Marduk protect his life. Marduk was the pagan god of Babylon. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had taken the articles from Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem and placed them in the temple of his God, in the temple of Marduk in Babylon. And renaming these guys, in a sense, is completing the job of showing, look how superior Marduk is to Yahweh, to the God of the Bible. These four guys, Daniel and his friends, they must have felt massively compromised. Hebrews, but in Babylon. Part of Yahweh's people, but with names that aligned them to the pagan god Marduk. Belonging to the God of the Bible, but living in the court of the king of Babylon. Now, some of us know what it's like to feel compromised. Maybe working for a company whose ethical practices make you feel uneasy. Or being part of a family where all the traditions go against the grain and just don't sit well with your faith in Jesus. Maybe it's living in a pretty godless shared flat or house or halls of residence. Being at school where what you believe and how you think it's right to live go totally against how everyone else sees it. Maybe it's just living in a society which at best is apathetic to Jesus and at worst is hostile to him. Now, given the situation they found themselves in, wouldn't it be best for these guys just to live as the Babylonians they were being turned into? Verse 8, let's have a look at it. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. What's going on here? Why does Daniel decide not to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine? The word used is a pretty significant one. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine that he drank. Why would eating the king's food have defiled Daniel? Now, there are various suggestions on this one. Some suggest that Daniel was wanting not to accept food that was non-kosher, that went against Jewish food laws. But if that is the reason, it doesn't explain why Daniel refused the wine as well, because in Jewish food laws, no problem drinking wine. Another suggestion is that Daniel wouldn't accept the meat and the wine because they'd have been offered in sacrifice to a pagan god. Daniel asked that he, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have only vegetables to eat. But look, the vegetables would have been offered to the pagan god as well. The whole lot would have done. The meat, the wine, the vegetables, the little nibbles before dinner, everything would have been offered to the pagan god. Others wonder whether Daniel and his friends were teetotal vegetarians, and that's why Daniel refuses the meat and the wine. But look, that can't be right either. Towards the end of the book, in chapter 10, Daniel's a much older man, and he received a disturbing vision from God. And this is what he says. At that time, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. So Daniel, as an older man, says, look, for 3 weeks I didn't eat any meat or drink any wine. Well, you only say that if you normally do eat meat and drink wine. And clearly that's what Daniel did. It means Daniel, as a younger man, can't have had a problem with the meat itself or a problem with the wine itself. The issue in Daniel 1 was where the meat and the wine that he and his friends were being offered came from, and therefore what consuming them would have signified. The thing is, as the old saying goes, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food the king ate and of the wine that he drank. But that was not strings free. To have eaten from the king's table, to have drunk the king's wine, would have signified that Daniel and his friends belonged to King Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel knew and wanted to make clear, perhaps himself as much as anyone else, that he didn't belong to Nebuchadnezzar, he belonged to God. That was the fundamental truth about him. He belonged to God. Yes, he was in Babylon, far away from Jerusalem, but he belonged to the God of Jerusalem and not to the king of Babylon. That is, I suspect, why he made the stand he did. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now, why did Daniel draw the line where he did? His name was changed from Daniel to Belteshazzar, a Babylonian name that thankfully never really caught on. Belteshazzar in the lion's den just doesn't quite have the ring that Daniel in the lion's den has. But why did Daniel allow the change of name but draw the line at the king's food? We're not told. Why did Daniel accept a Babylonian education but refuse the king's wine? We're not told. You would imagine that there were plenty of ethical issues with which Daniel had to wrestle. Plenty of times he felt uncomfortable or conflicted. Maybe the key thing isn't why did Daniel decide to draw a line there? Maybe the key thing is Daniel decided to draw a line somewhere. He drew a line to show that he belonged to God. It's honored by God. We read in verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. The chief of the eunuchs could have laughed Daniel out of court. Worse, he could have reported Daniel for his outrageous request. Daniel's request was far from risk-free. Why was the request even given the time of day? Because God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. It is God's doing. It is, if you like, his divine seal of approval on the stand that Daniel makes. Now, we shouldn't draw some sort of theology that it will always go well for us when we make a stand for God. 5 chapters on in the book of Daniel, he makes another stand of God for God. A law is passed that makes it illegal to pray. Daniel continues to pray, and that ends up with him being thrown into the den of lions. Sometimes we make a stand for God, and it ends up with life going very badly indeed. Yeah, indeed, for hundreds of Christians today, they will be killed for taking a stand for Christ. But verse 9 is here to help us see that God approves of Daniel's refusal to eat the royal food and drink the royal wine. And Daniel was refusing those things, remember, to demonstrate perhaps to himself as anyone else that he belonged to God. If you are trusting in Jesus Christ, you belong to God. You don't belong to your employer. They don't have ultimate authority over what you should and should not do. Your first allegiance It isn't to your social class or your ethnic background, what's expected of you by your culture. You don't even belong to your family. And sometimes to be faithful to Christ means going against what your family wants. If you are in Christ, you belong to God. This is what the Apostle Paul wrote to the Christians in Corinth. You are not your own, you were bought at a price. So glorify God in your body. You are not your own, you were bought at a price. The price with which Christians have been bought is the price of the blood of Jesus, shed on the cross when he died in our place. We now belong to the one who paid that great price. I wonder if I can ask you, when did you last make it clear that you belong to Christ? I'm not talking about when you last said you belonged to him, or when you last talked about going to church. When did you last take action that showed to others or showed to yourself that your first loyalty is to Christ? Let's think back to those three situations we started with: Rob, Amanda, and Paddy. They are primarily, I want to suggest, issues of belonging rather than behaving. The best thing might be for Rob to go to his mother's big birthday bash and miss church that Sunday. He can always hear the sermon on the website. Rob will have to weigh up what going to church might do to his relationship with his mother if he's deliberately defying her wishes. Might be right to go to his mum's. But maybe he should draw a line. Show that although he loves his mum and cares for her, he doesn't belong to her. Maybe Rob should go to church and get to hers a bit later than she would like. Perhaps Amanda should just swallow what's expected of her at work. Might be to make a fuss would be unwise. After all, David didn't refuse his name change or his Babylonian education. To go with what's expected of her at work, it might be the right thing. But maybe Amanda needs to draw a line to show that she belongs to God, who bought her at a price, rather than belong to the company that pays her wages. Might be a costly thing to do, but it might be the right thing to do. Maybe for Paddy, the right thing to do is to go to the party. Just try and stay out of trouble's way. After all, the whole hall's going to be there. Or maybe he needs to show them that he does not belong to them. He belongs to Christ. Maybe he should avoid that party to make it clear that no matter what everyone else is doing, he belongs to Christ. Daniel 1 doesn't give us a tick list of do this, don't do that. If we're trusting in Christ, it challenges us at a much more fundamental level about who we belong to. And there is a challenge here for us. When did you last demonstrate that first and foremost you belong to God? Not to your family or your employer or your group of friends, but to God who bought you with the blood of Christ. When did you last take a stand to show that you belong to him? If you're not trusting in Jesus, maybe you're here thinking things through, investigating, you need to know that if you were to do so, it will come at a cost. Belonging to Jesus means putting him first in your life. And that that will disrupt some of your current relationships and allegiances. Daniel drew his line with food and drink from the king's table, and so he makes his request to the chief eunuch. And although Ashpenaz is favorably disposed to Daniel, he is also no fool. Nebuchadnezzar was undoubtedly a megalomaniac. And I would imagine that spending time working for a megalomaniac wisens you up a bit. So verse 10, the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, with good reason, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king." And so Daniel proposes a 10-day trial in which he, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah eat only vegetables and drink only water. Verse 15, at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now, we're not mad in our society on fatness of flesh, but it was very much valued in this society. Fatness of flesh, it was the thing you wanted. So verse 15 is a very approving comment. They were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. Now, I'm no great expert when it comes to nutrition, but I think I'm right in saying that vegetables are not one of the food types noted for making you fat. If you were to go to Weight Watchers or Slimming World, and I'm certainly not saying you should, so no offense taken, please, but if you were to go to one of those groups, there would not be someone saying to you there, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, make sure you avoid those vegetables because they're terribly fattening. Curly kale, moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. Just cut it out of your diet altogether." Vegetables do not make you fat. Now, it's not the greatest miracle in the Bible, but vegetables and water making these four guys look healthy in appearance and fat in flesh, this is a miracle. It is God's doing. They should have lost weight, not put it on. What is unmistakably happening in this chapter is that God is at work. Verse 17, as for these four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. They're found to be far and away the pick of the crop, and not just of those that they learned with. Verse 20, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. Now, I don't want us to find a sort of false prosperity theology here, along the lines of honor God, show you belong to him, and everything will go well for you. I don't think we should do that. In our three imagined situations, Rob's mother might stop talking to him. Amanda might lose her job. Paddy might lose his group of friends. But what we do see in Daniel 1 is that God chooses to bless and to use these four men who made a stand to show that they belong to him. If you are trusting in Christ, you belong to God. Not your family, not your employer, not your social group. You belong to God. Let me ask you, if someone were to look at your life, would they see evidence of that? Would it be plain to them that no matter what else is true of you, the first and the foremost thing is that you belong to God? The point on which Daniel made a stand, his line in the sand, was refusing the royal food and wine. What about you? Where's your line in the sand? Where do you need to take a stand to show that you belong to God? What, as a result of looking at this passage together, is God calling you to do to show that you belong to him?